Welcome, everyone. My name is Professor David Lurcher from the School of Library and Information Science at San Jose State University in cooperation with the Queensland University of Technology, to the final seminar of Marianne Harlan. Her dissertation's title is The Information Practices of Teen Content Creators. And her committee has been Christine Bruce, Helen Partridge both from Australia, Judy Weedman, and myself from San Jose State University. Marianne is going to make her presentation now, and so we would ask, we will have a question and answer period afterward, but we'd ask that you not use the back channel while she is speaking. And so, Marianne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Welcome to my final seminar on Information Practices of Teen Content Creators, the intersection of actions and experiences. This presentation will focus primarily on the research findings and the constructed theory of teens' information practices in digital content creating communities. However, I'm going to start by providing a brief overview of the background of the research problem, the method used to collect and analyze data, and the components of the literature review that provided context to the findings. I will then introduce three parts of the information practice theory: the digital participatory communities, the experiences of information, and the information actions. Finally, I introduce the information practices and a model of how the practices interact while creating content. Teens have drawn pictures, sang and wrote their songs, filmed videos, wrote stories, and poetry well before the web was part of their daily lives. And the web is part of their daily lives. In the United States, 95% of teens are online. What the network and global nature of the web has done is give rise to content creating communities that teens can participate in to share their creations with a wider audience. Over 2/3 of online teens have shared content, according to a 2009 survey from the Pew Internet and American Life Project. The research problem that guided this investigation was how are teens engaging with information in order to participate in creating and sharing content. The research method I used was constructivist grounded theory, as outlined by Kathy Sharmaz in her 2006 book, Constructing Grounded Theory. Therefore, it's important to note that the research focus of what are teens' information practices was constructed from the data and developed fully over the course of collection and analysis. Collection and analysis was simultaneous and iterative. The primary data collection method was semi-structured interviews with 11 teens who participate in creating content. In some instances, there were multiple interviews with the same teen. Interviews were analyzed using an open coding process, and interview questions were adjusted to explore emerging concepts, and further interviews were then conducted from there. I also observed communities teens were participating in. Observations were non-participatory, although I had permission from teens to access and view their profiles and content. As I mentioned previously, as data was collected, it was analyzed, which led to further data collection and a construction of a theory. This theory was co-constructed with participants in the sense that it was their experiences providing data, but also in that early versions of the theory were shared with participants for feedback. Furthermore, there were interviews that focused on the emerging constructed theory, which Sharmaz refers to as theoretical sampling. This process continued until categories were saturated or no new concepts were emerging. The research question, what are the information practices of teen content creators, was constructed from early analysis of the data, which rose from the participants who were interviewed for the pilot study. It has three components: describing the social structure of the community as represented by participation and interaction, and the tools of the community that allowed for that participation and interaction; describing the various ways information was experienced while participating and creating and sharing content; and describing the actions in which teens engaged in while participating, creating, and sharing content. These components intersected and became teens' information practices. In grounded theory, the role of the literature review is often debated, with many believing that the literature review should come only after data collection. However, Dunn suggests that the literature review that occurs prior to data collection can provide insight into a gap in the research, as well as providing sensitizing concepts. According to Sharmaz, sensitizing concepts are a place to start and are general ideas that provide context to the research interests. However, she cautions against allowing them to act as limitations to our ideas. The literature reviewed prior to and in the very early stages of data collection revealed a gap in the research and suggested form to the interview questions, allowing me to adopt both a position of deliberate naivete while still demonstrating awareness of teens' online communities and practices. I reviewed the literature in areas of digital communities, online teens, and youth information behaviors. I begin with reviewing the definition of Web 2.0 and its relationship to participatory culture. While Web 2.0 is not the popular term it once was, it had a relationship to the definition of participatory cultures. Jenkins and others define participatory culture as a culture with, quote, relatively low barriers to artistic expression and civic engagement, strong support for creating and sharing one's creation, and some type of informal membership, end quote. In O'Reilly's definition of Web 2.0, his first principle is designing and using software as a native web application that is constantly updated and delivered. I would add, often at low cost and simple to use. This is related to the low barrier of access. The second principle, harnessing of collective intelligence of small sites and users of the web, shifts the role of user from being a consumer to being a producer of information and is related to the strong support for sharing and informal mentoring. The third principle, mashups of data and applications, introduce new forms of content, which relates to support for artistic expression. The sites of investigation for this research were conceptualized as digital participatory communities using the relationship between these two definitions as a sensitizing concept. I also reviewed emerging research on online teens, focusing on their content creating practices. This research suggested teens participated in online communities for diverse reasons, and that content creating had different motivations and outcomes, such as exploring identity, participating in civic opportunities and actions, and exploring creative interests. While there are other practices that online teens engage in, such as social activities, game playing, and money making, I primarily focused on creating content. This literature had a gap in that it did not explicitly address the role of information in these activities. I also reviewed youth information behavior research. Much of the youth information behavior research constructs youth as solo actors, often as students, and it focuses on seeking. This indicates that there's a need for research that explores how youth seek and use information for creative and personal interest. The emergence of everyday life information seeking framework has produced research that addresses this to a small extent. However, it still tends to focus on youth as seekers of information needs that are related to developmental concerns such as sexuality, health, careers, and drug use, rather than recreational creative interests. It did, however, provide some context to the study, particularly in the finding that youth seek information in both purposive and non-purposive ways. Although information use research is less common, there was some relevance to the findings that also provided sensitizing concepts. For instance, Ross Todd suggested that youth are, quote, not passive robot-like processors of information, rather they are active creators of new knowledge, end quote. This was important as it suggested that content creation is an active creation of new knowledge. Still, I had a concern that youth should be understood as members of a community and that their practices not be understood as solely individually cognitive. This concern emerging from the data led me to practice theory and community of practice work. The literature reviewed in regards to practice occurred after initial data collection, analysis, and construction of emergent theory. This literature provided nuance to my analysis and eventually to the framework of information practices of teen content creators. This could be considered theoretical sensitivity, which Sharma describes as flashes of illuminating insight. There are three areas of theoretical sensitivity that I reviewed: practice theory, community of practice research, and information practice research. While there is no one agreed upon definition of practice, practice theory has common elements in how practices are described. Practices are situated within a particular context, or as Shatsky says, a site, as well as a particular time. They are shaped by both the social structure where they are taking place, which includes the tacit knowledge of the roles, rules, and norms of the interaction within the community, as well as the technical tools available within the site. Practices are embodied and understood physically, but they are also understood through discursive negotiation. Therefore, language also shapes practice, as it is one of the ways meaning is constructed and understood. One of the elements of the findings was the role the community had in shaping teens' information practice. This led me to a community of practice framework. Community of practices are defined through participation of members. According to Winger, there are 3 dimensions: mutual engagement, joint enterprise, and a shared repertoire. Mutual engagement is the engagement of a common purpose. Joint enterprise is how meaning is constructed of that mutual engagement, and a shared repertoire is the resources used and created by the joint enterprise. This framework provided nuance into the analysis of digital participatory communities that I will be exploring later. Information practices is an emerging framework in information science research. Similar to practice theory, there is not currently a unifying definition, although Savalainen suggests that it is an umbrella concept of, quote, the ways people seek, use, and share information, end quote. Information practice research primarily takes place within a sociocultural worldview, and the focus tends to be on communities and distributed knowledge and information sharing and use rather than on a single cognitive individual. In the constructed theory of teens' information practices, there were 3 components: the community, the actions, and the experiences of information. Teens' information practices include the experiences of information as they intersect with information actions and are situated within digital participatory communities. I will now describe each of these elements. Communities of practice form around a mutual engagement, and often online communities reflect offline interest. This slide represents some of the communities that teens were participants in. The mutual engagement of these communities was the sharing of content. This was governed by both explicit statements and implicit understandings. The joint enterprise of the community was shaped by implicit understandings, which included the tenor of interaction, the types of the content a community valued, and the roles within the community. For example, most communities had explicit requirements regarding the tenor of interaction, forbidding name-calling and personal attacks. But as more than one participant noted, there were different norms of interaction on YouTube, which implicitly did allow attacks. 2 participants actually used similar phrasing in discussing this phenomenon, referring to it as, quote, acting like 5-year-olds. Part of the joint enterprise was also determining the content a community valued. This was often done through popularity algorithms that identified likes, views, and linking, so it was shaped by the technical structure as well as the social structure of the community. Additionally, the joint enterprise suggested roles in the community that were both implicit and explicit. While some communities had moderators, often roles in the communities were formed through the negotiation of this joint enterprise. Roles were things like newbies, expert content creators, or even, as Data said, just another member. The shared repertoire of the communities of practices were the performances of the members. This was both the content they shared and the conversations that occurred through icons and through text. Commenting is an important technical affordance of all of these communities, as was the ability to easily demonstrate an emotional reaction to the content through emoticons. The shared content, which occasionally referenced other content, helped communities in constructing meaning. Therefore, the joint enterprise that resulted in the shared repertoires that shaped the purpose of the community defined the norms, identified what a community valued, identified explicit and implicit rules, and the tacit rules of the site. While each of these communities had unique elements, the basic concepts were the same. The information actions I describe are performances. By themselves, actions do not have meaning. How they are situated in a community and how the information is experienced produces a space for making meaning of the actions so that they do become performances. While I will explore the experiences of information later in this presentation, I'm now going to introduce the specific actions in the categories of gathering, thinking, and creating. Teens used different gathering actions to participate in digital content creating communities. They engaged in actions to collect information that included serendipitous encounters, observation, focused browsing, and direct searching. Information actions that assisted in gathering were both unintentionally and intentionally enacted. The gathering actions often occurred simultaneously with thinking and/or creating actions. Serendipitous encountering involved encountering information in their daily lives, both on and offline. It was characterized by an openness or a willingness to pay attention to their worlds. This openness involved a noting of the information that interested them or, quote, spoke to them. In serendipitous encounters, information was gathered just as a participant was recognizing a need. Information came at a fortuitous moment and often from someone with similar interests. Observation was primarily about understanding the social structures of a community of practice, and in the digital world is referred to as lurking. Observation was generally an intentional act and a conscious decision, although not always guided by an articulated need. Focus browsing represented actions that reflected a more intentional process of gathering. Although not one yet characterized by need, it often occurred by participants defined themselves as bored. Despite the vagueness of their need, they often had a broad subject of interest, such as I'm searching for a flower. They often used tools such as a What's New feed on a site, Stumble Upon, or Tumblr, and they also engaged in link surfing. Direct searching occurred as teens created content. Teens often discovered a need for information based on a lack of skills, particularly the skills that were necessary to create content that, quote, matched the pictures in my head. Direct searching leveraged a number of different sources. Teens used site search engines, they searched Google and YouTube, or would turn to people as mentors with specific questions. While teens gather information, they're engaging in thinking actions. These include musing, considering, evaluating, planning, and reflecting. Each of these actions reflect a very subtle difference. Thinking reflected engagement with information, including integrating information into existing knowledge so that it could be used in a creative process. Musing is a subconscious mental process that often began with a serendipitous gathering of information. It is an unintentional action, and it exists in the background. Swift expressed it most clearly when she said, quote, sometimes it gets so wrapped up in your subconscious you forget about it and it comes out later. Often, teens didn't recognize the source of an idea. For instance, Hannah Susanna shrugged off a question regarding the source of a piece of information as something that was out there. This suggests that while taking in information, teens are not necessarily aware that they are taking in information, and the information is being mused upon until they're ready to use it in a more intentional manner. Considering occurred when an idea moved from the background or musing to the foreground. This is primarily related to intentionality regarding content, in which a choice is made regarding the style and focus. During the action of considering, the idea is intentionally explored. It was essential for teens to develop a personal aesthetic within the shared repertoire of the communities, and it also helped teens discover where their content fit within the community. Considering is a more conscious action than musing, and it involved interacting with, quote, a whole bunch of things. Planning often demonstrated the visible use of information. It was the action of identifying what teens needed to create content. This included identifying skills and tools. It also involved brainstorming the substance of the content. Planning actions were visible and concrete in some instances, such as doodles, thumbnails, sketches, and invisible in others, teens often describing content that, quote, formed itself. This was particularly true of filmmakers. Other planning activities were social as well, including brainstorming and discussions. The thinking action of evaluating is the action of using criteria to judge authority and relevance. Teens identified authoritative sources of information or sources that they trusted to provide valued information to help improve their process through established social criteria and personal aesthetic. In some cases, authority was determined through established markers, such as whether or not the information emanated from a professional source or was a teacher. More frequently, however, teens relied on authority markers such as popularity within the community, self-confidence of the information provider, and whether or not the initial information provided was helpful, in which case it was a source to which teens would return. They also relied on their own personal aesthetic, using people whose content they admired as an authority within the field. Reflecting actions occurred while using information for content creation. As they created content, teens reflected on what they knew, what they still needed and or wanted to know, and how their artifact had meaning within the community. Reflecting actions related to applied knowledge during the process of creating. Therefore, they were closely related to process and learning by doing, as well as reflecting upon the artifact. Creating actions include the range of actions teens engage in while producing visible content. These are copying, modeling, and composing. Creating actions represent information use in a very concrete way. Copying was an explicit reproduction of another's content. Copying was primarily a way to use information to learn specific skills. This was particularly true for the visual artists and musicians, where teens copied another person's artifact in order to master the tools and techniques. One benefit of copying is that it provides physical information in the terms of body control. This is particularly true of visual artists. It also shapes skills in programming and site design as well. Copying helped build confidence as teens interacted within the community. They were, however, very aware of and followed implicit rules within the community regarding copying. For instance, writers would copy format and types of posts, but not the actual written content. Ronnie was careful not to, she was an artist, and she was careful not to post art she had copied to learn a technique, whereas Zeta, the other visual artist, would with attribution, but only of common objects or of life drawing, but not of copyrighted or original characters. Modeling was the intermediate step between copying and the creation of more original content. Modeling involved exploring and applying a personal aesthetic in the creating process. In modeling, the source of the idea is apparent and the application of knowledge gained regarding the tools is explored. Modeling was a way for teens to continue to explore what they knew within their creating process, and it allowed them to build confidence while exploring their personal aesthetic. Composing was also a representation of applied information and knowledge. Unlike modeling, composing was marked by the resulting content not being obviously based on someone else's content. However, some participants were aware of the influences on their composing and less likely to adopt a position that their work was completely original. For instance, Salamonde, a musician, said, quote, "It's like making a quilt. You just kind of gather all this stuff and then it looks cool in the end," end quote. And she went on to say that because she put it together, it was definitely hers. Composing occasionally lacked intentionality, happening in what appeared to be an organic way. Swift and Salamonde, who worked together, would describe it this way. It was just kind of like we took the mic and just started. We had this beat that I made and we started going off, and then there's like this Tolkien sentence in there. We just took it and then Salamonde made it into a song, end quote. In composing, teens became producers of knowledge they shared with their community. This had the potential to engage the community and lead to more information that could be used to continue to create and share content. Thus, composing demonstrated knowledge of skills and community. While participating in creating content, teens experienced information in different ways. There were 5 categories of experiences of information: participation, inspiration, collaboration, process, and artifact. The information actions enabled experiences of information. However, it should be kept in, but the experiences of information also affect the information actions. Therefore, it should be kept in mind that while these 2 components of information are presented separately, they definitely intersect. Experiencing information as participation was being a member of a community. The experience of information as participation exposed the norms, rules, and tenor of social interaction and the way tools were used. This occurred both through explicit statements and implicit knowledge. The specific processes of information as participation include an awareness of the community, understanding the audience, and understanding the norms. For example, in experiencing information as participation, the design and audience of a site was impacted the teens' understanding of the community. Zeta described her understanding of Gaia as designed for younger audiences because of the visuals, stressing that, quote, "Instead of having a photo of you, they're a very anti-photo site. You get a little avatar thing," end quote. This suggested that the audience was younger, and she experienced this as participation. This also exposed an awareness of a need for a different site, but it was an implicit understanding. Information as participation also suggested norms of interaction. In his description of Vimeo versus YouTube, Goko said he didn't want to put videos on YouTube where the quote, "I don't know, ignorant people could comment on them and say ignorant stuff. I wanted to put them on Vimeo and I got good comments on them," end quote. The implicit norm on Vimeo is constructive criticism, which Goku understood through experiencing information as participation, whereas YouTube for him was a place for ignorant comments, despite explicit statements regarding interaction. It's not necessary to actively contribute to the experience of information information as participation. For example, Ronnie constructed an understanding of art theft and attribution through experiencing information as participation by observing interactions and the community debate of the concept, but not by specifically contributing to it. Another way teens experienced information was as inspiration. Information as inspiration was underpinned by emotional resonance. Swift specifically referred to an emotion stating, quote, "A lot of my inspiration comes from an emotion," end quote. It often was experienced through an event that teens constructed as fun. The emotional resonance suggested that the experience of information as inspiration is embodied. Information as inspiration comes from teens' everyday lives, from riffing off shared experiences or rapping about what they saw, using a line they overheard as dialogue. Furthermore, the social structures of their personal communities impacted the how information experienced as inspiration was constructed. Backgrounds attuned them to things such as Sam's socially conscious rap, which developed from her gang and homelessness background, or Lolly's social isolation in middle school, which attuned her to different subcultures. Information that is experienced as collaboration consists of the shared knowledge and shared skills. It can be understood as what people know together or what skills, talents, and knowledge we can combine together to develop better content. Information as collaboration is experienced through relationships that are built on shared interests. Visibly, it looks like brainstorming as teens shared knowledge with one another. For instance, Jack described it this way. Quote, "We looked at each other's code, we helped each other with programs, we recommended books, we lent books to one another and pointed out websites," end quote. In this way, he and his partner shared common resources, helped each other with specific content, and built a partnership that he relied on throughout his programming process. Experiencing information as collaboration increased confidence in the actual artifact. Information as collaboration was also constructing shared knowledge within the community that becomes tacit knowledge. For example, Lolly's community engaged in a conversation about pets as fashion accessories. Experiencing others' opinions through comments and references was experiencing information as collaboration, and it shaped the shared knowledge of her small community. In summary, experiencing information as collaboration involves building a shared repertoire of knowledge. The experience of information as process involves the use of tools to create. It was often described as playing with tools or pushing random buttons. In this sense, it was embodied. The information was related to the physical skills necessary. It was also occurred in selecting the appropriate platform. Lolly in particular demonstrated an awareness of different tools to create and share her writing and art, and the different affordances of each of those tools. In discussing the choice to maintain a blog versus a website, she framed it in terms of the purpose of the content and eventually chose the blog for the structure of frequent updates versus the more static nature of a website. She experienced information as process in using these different platforms. It was also embodied in more abstract ways. Goku discovered that he didn't have patience to redo animation shots and that time was a factor in process. Therefore, information that is experienced as a process often emerges in the doing. Experiencing information as artifact was an explicit representation of the other four experiences. The experience of information as process suggested the ability to create content, which meant that participants had used tools to create content that reflected their inspiration, and in doing so, experienced information as participation and collaboration while they constructed knowledge. Experiencing information as artifact is answering the question, do I know? It was also related to intangible concepts, such as the emotion Sam described regarding her identity. In looking back at her previous content, she described she wanted to change the subject of her current music, saying, quote, "When I first started, I was like, I'm the most gangsterish gangsta," end quote. And she evolved into much more socially conscious music through experiencing information as artifact. Others used artifact to explore identities as well, changing their profiles and names. Furthermore, artifacts also provided information in terms of their future information needs. Much of the process of creating content occurred through trial and error. Each process provided further information from the resulting artifact using reflections, and teens would improve content or leave things behind as they experienced different information as artifacts. In summary, information as artifact represents a concrete form of knowledge as well as abstract ideas. It's concrete in the terms of the skills or the tools needed, and abstract in terms of the disposition such as patience or resilience. Experiencing information as artifact reminds participants of what they know, who they are, who they have been, and it also represents to the outsider their application of the information of the community. In the model of information practices, they represent the intersection of experiences of information and information actions as they are situated in the digital participatory community. There are 5 information practices that are tied to information experiences with different embedded actions. The practices are learning community, negotiating aesthetic, negotiating control, negotiating capacity, and representing knowledge. These practices are situated within the context of the community. Therefore, the practices are shaped through the community's social structure and technical affordances. However, this is a dependent engagement. By engaging in these practices, teens produce performances that are shared within the community. Therefore, teens shape community through engaging in these practices. In the first information practice, learning community, an understanding of the tacit knowledge of the community is constructed. This includes implicit roles, rules, norms, and what the community values. The experience of information as participation is embedded in learning community, and information is gathered through observation, the thinking action of evaluating occurs, and the understandings are constructed that are constructed are represented in copying, modeling, and composing. Learning community is how teens engage with information in order to understand how to be within the community and provides context to the other information practices. Learning community informs the intentional choice to adopt a community or become a member of that community. In adopting a community, information is experienced as participation. This information is gathered through observation and evaluated based on criteria that teens have developed, such as easy access, going back to that participatory culture definition, free hosting, strong social support, and membership. They wanted communities that provided feedback and were fun and friendly. Observation of communities allowed teens to evaluate the communities based on this developed criteria. If the communities were evaluated as not meeting a need, then teens may not become active content sharers. For example, Jack lacked the confidence to share the computer game he was developing offline with his online community. In this particular community, there were very high standards regarding content. He said, quote, "These hardcore developers, if you suggest I'm doing something and you make this grand extravagant plan, you generally get laughed at," end quote. Although he continued to observe and engage in learning community, he chose not to actively share content. Learning community informs how teens position themselves within their community. As members, they experience information as participation and construct their role. Are they a newbie? Are they just another member? And they also look to their potential role, often wanting to become an expert. It also informs how teens position their creating within a community in regard to the implicit rules of the community. How they respond to the ethics in regards to copying would be an example. And how they position their content in regard to what they know about the community. For example, using a favored character such as Zeta's morbid rabbit that we saw on the earlier slide in a variety of art pieces. Information practices of learning community allows teens to construct their understanding of the community, adopt a community, position themselves within the roles of the community, and position their performance within the implicit rules and norms of the community. Negotiating aesthetic is how teens engage with information to develop and represent their identity and content. They experience information as inspiration, which they gather through the information action of serendipitous encountering while performing the information action of musing. This often occurs simultaneously. They also gather information through the action of focused browsing and performing the information action of considering. And they are negotiating their aesthetic through using the information experienced as information and representing it, developed in the information action of modeling. Information that is experienced as inspiration that is serendipitously encountered is the impetus for information action of musing, therefore they intersect. During musing, teens are negotiating their personal values in regards to aesthetics. During focused browsing that intersects with considering, teens gather information in regard to community aesthetics and consider it through the lens of the personal aesthetic, their own personal aesthetic. It's how teens engage the concept, how will I represent this idea in my own way? Teens then engaged in the action of modeling as they represented their own content in relationship to the information that they had experienced as inspiration. Modeling allowed teens to consciously use the content of the community but manipulate the content to represent what it was they were personally valuing. The information practice of negotiating aesthetics overlaps with the information practices of negotiating control and negotiating capacity. While a teen is shaping their personal aesthetic in relationship to the community, they are also constructing their understanding of how the aesthetics are represented in content. This is negotiating the control of knowledge, and furthermore, in implying that aesthetic, they are negotiating capacity. The information practice of negotiating control is how teens construct their understanding of the community's knowledge. It is a process of developing ownership of that knowledge, whether it's abstract, such as the sort of discourse of the community or how to be within the community, or physical, such as the process of creating content, or concrete, such as explicit rules. Negotiating control occurs as information is experienced as collaboration and through the information actions of planning, direct searching, considering, modeling, and composing. In negotiating control, there is an overt negotiation between members to discover and agree on what the community knows. In this manner, it is situated within the social structures of the community. In engaging in the information action of planning and direct searching while experiencing information as collaboration, teens identify members of the community that can provide assistance in the form of community knowledge. This allows them to negotiate control of knowledge through interacting with the distributed knowledge of the community. This also occurred through the action of considering information experienced as collaboration as teens explored different lenses on information, such as opinions. Negotiating control is also represented in the action of composing as it intersects with information experienced as collaboration. This is particularly true in the action of composing as a partnership, such as Salamondi and Swift. And the content represents the knowledge of more than one person. This is not always easy. Agreeing upon simple items allowed a foundation for shared information regarding rules, but the more complexity to the shape of the knowledge, the more difficult it was to have one community conceptualization of the knowledge. This indicates that negotiating control is an ongoing process and that it produces difficulties as the information experienced as collaboration increases in complexity. Negotiating control in regard to ownership of process is about sharing skills to create content. It represents a common understanding of how to leverage members of a community to compose content while still applying personal skills. Communities that have a social structure that encourage sharing of the composing process allow teens to negotiate the action of composing in a way that represents physical knowledge. As a case in point, Sam and Salamondi, who weren't normal collaborators but did a musical collaboration, was negotiating control of the action of composing in the manner that it allowed both of them to represent their personal embodied knowledge. Negotiating control is how teens construct their knowledge of the discourse of the community as they represent it in their interactions and content. As mentioned previously, it involves negotiating aesthetics. It also involves negotiating capacity, as that allows teens to represent their understandings. The information practice of negotiating capacity is the application of skills to create content. It is enabled by information experienced as processed through the actions of copying, modeling, and composing. Negotiating capacity is an embodied information practice as it relates to physical skills. While negotiating capacity, specific information needs are revealed. As teens engage in creating practices and experienced information as processed, they discover their specific needs and then therefore engage in the information action of direct searching. Negotiating capacity represents the intersection of reflection and information as process. For instance, as teens engaged in the action of creating, they learned not only the specific information they needed for creating, but also how they felt about it. Furthermore, what they learned transformed some of their actions involved in creating. Without engaging in the information practice of negotiating capacity, teens would not be able to engage in the information practice of representing knowledge. Negotiating capacity exposes the information necessary to represent how teens have negotiated their aesthetic and their control. In the next section, I will describe how these three information practices result in representing knowledge. The information practice of representing knowledge is the outcome of negotiating aesthetics, control, and capacity. It engages the information experience of information as artifact and the information actions of reflecting, modeling, and composing. An artifact is a concrete representation of their knowledge that is created through modeling and composing, but it is the action of reflecting that produces information as artifact and allows teens to construct the artifact as a representation of their knowledge. In the information practice of representing knowledge, teens are representing their role through content and contributing to the shared repertoire of the community. Composing was the information action that produced the representation of representing knowledge. However, it intersected with reflection as teens experienced information as artifact and how they defined it as original. Ila Wynn described an artifact that represented her knowledge as, quote, having a certain unique thing about it that was impossible to copy, end quote. Teens represented their knowledge through the experience of information as artifact and the action of reflecting by constructing their understanding of the content as theirs, my own beats, or my emotions. They're demonstrating the outcomes of information practices of negotiating. While information experiences artifact provides information about what their future needs are, it also provides information regarding how they understand the tacit knowledge of the community and position themselves in their content in the community. It also helps them shape their identity as they represent themselves through their content. Teens contribute their knowledge to the community through these representations, which allows the community to engage in constructing new knowledge, as was seen in negotiating control. So representing knowledge is both an outcome and a beginning to further the information practices of learning community, negotiating aesthetics, control, and capacity. So I've described 5 information practices that are the findings of this research. The categories of information practice should not be viewed as independent. Teens participated in one or more categories of practice simultaneously. They moved iteratively through the practices while engaged within their communities, and the practices interact and overlap as teens engaged in participating. In the graphic on the slide, information practices related to negotiating overlap to represent that they might occur simultaneously with one another. For instance, negotiating aesthetic occurs as teens negotiate control, and negotiating control of knowledge occurs as teens negotiate their capacity to create content. The negotiating information practices are embedded in representing knowledge. If the negotiating information practices do not occur, teens can't represent their knowledge. These 4 information practices are then embedded in learning community. As teens engage in representing their knowledge, they open up a communicative space in which they are participating in the discourse of the community by leveraging the social and technical structures. They have, in representing knowledge, produced a performance that allows the information practice of learning community to continue and transform. The practices build upon one another. They occur simultaneously, and they rely upon each other to produce information necessary for creating and sharing content in digital communities. Before we open the floor to questions, I'd like to thank my supervisors, Dr. Christine Bruce, Dr. David Lurcher, and Dr. Mandy Lepton, the participants who I cannot name, but who were allowed me into their lives, and the cohorts and the Gateway program at San Jose State for all, and Queensland University of Technology for all of their support.
Well, thank you very much, Marianne. Before you came to this study, you were very familiar with teenagers. Describe to us that experience that brought you to your topic.
I'm sorry, because we're in the same room, I have a little bit of a back echo. You want me to describe my, just nod, you want me to describe my background? Okay. Prior to this, I was a teacher librarian for 2 years in a middle school, for 8 years in a high school, and had worked prior to that as an English teacher with middle schoolers. So I have great love and respect for youth and their agency, and advocate for that, and sort of where I came from and the position that I came from, and informed this research for sure.
And so you already had a deep understanding of the teenage mind and workings and learning and all those things. And so why did you choose grounded theory as your methodology?
I chose grounded theory because, as I just mentioned, I have a deep respect for teens' agency, and I didn't necessarily see that there was a tremendous, I mean, keeping in mind, I hate to say this now, but keeping in mind that when I started this process, you know, I wasn't as well versed in the research as I am now, but I didn't see a lot of research that had that respect for teens' agency, and I wanted to do something that came from teens' voice and teens' perspective, and so I was considering both ethnography and grounded theory, and I really didn't have a good solid handle on their information seeking, and particularly their information use, and I thought that grounded theory offered me an opportunity to investigate that question without, I mean, it's shaded obviously by my experience, but without shading it by other theoretical implications that I actually had some criticisms of even when I began this process.
So as you began to gather data, you tried to resist the temptation to formulate your findings as others maybe would have done. But I noticed during the reading of your dissertation that suddenly, after much analysis, you were able to discover the theory that you were described that process to us.
Well, I mean, because data analysis is so iterative, particularly in grounded theory, every time I went back to the data, something emerged that I had a question about, and then I would take it back to the teens and do. I did a series of theoretical interviews. Particularly once the information actions and the experiences of information were emerging, I went back and asked questions about those experiences and how those intersected with the actions and how it worked. And then I talked about the theoretical sensitivity of the practice work because that really was a bit of an aha moment for me, where all of the experiences information and the information actions and the role of the community had emerged within the data analysis, but in going back to the literature, it gave me the language to shape the theory that eventually emerged from that, and sort of allowed me to locate my research in a framework that was in some ways existing, that allows me to communicate with other researchers who are interested in similar types of things. And so that's sort of how I came to that process. I think I answered that question.
Thanks, you answered it very well. So let's open the mic to members in the group tonight, and you're welcome to ask Marianne questions. What you do is if you look toward the top of the screen, there's a little hand. You can raise your hand, and then you just open your mic. Now, when you finish answering your question, will you please turn the mic off? You got the talk button there, so you're going to press on it to open the mic, and then, like a toggle switch, when you're through, click on it again. So, first question, who would like to ask? Go ahead and open your mic and speak to us.
Hi, I'm sorry, David and Marianne. David, when you were asking around about the theory creation, I had this question as I was listening to your talk, Marianne, particularly around when you're describing the information experiences, about how applicable this would be to adults, and particularly maybe even beginning adult content creators. And so my question was about how the theory might apply to adult content creators as well. And I'm sorry, I pasted that into our chat, so you can read the full question there, whether it's you found something that's applicable, if you're considering if your theory is applicable, or if that's something that you consider in a follow-up study.
Thanks. Actually, it is something that I have considered, although I identified it as a limitation to this study because I did focus solely on teens. But the communities that the teens were operating in and participating in have all generations within them. And so there's definitely adult content creators that are helping define those communities of practice. And so I suspect that there would be applicability to the adults in those communities, but it really would be future research to see if it works the same way for the adults in that community. Yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that.
Go ahead. Who's the next question?
Hi, Marianne. I really did enjoy your talk, and one of the questions that's been coming up for me kind of continually is when you talk about ways that information is experienced, and you talk about it being experienced as inspiration, as participation, as collaboration, as process, and as artifact. A lot of people would express similar, maybe a similar idea differently. They would say that information was encountered through participation, or information was created through collaboration. I can think of a lot of different verbs that might be put in there. The question I would like to ask you is your choice of using the word as, particularly, and experienced as inspiration rather than experienced through inspiration or through collaboration. I'd just like to hear you talk about that, please. Let me let go of my mic here. I'm trying.
So I think one of the reasons, it's interesting that you bring up the word as, because I understand what you're saying, and I was thinking about this recently, particularly in and around the idea of information as inspiration. And I think one of the reasons why this, that I prefer the experience as, is because it indicates the embodied nature of information that we tend to overlook. We think about, I go back to Buckland's idea of information as process, information as knowledge, and information as thing. And there's a piece there that I want to add, which is this idea of experiencing something physically and emotionally in an embodied sense that I think is really important. And so that's where that experience, I know what you're talking about, and I did try to address that to some extent in the literature review, but I think that, you know, what came from the kids is that there is this sort of like, I mean, I can't talk about how many times they used the word emotion when they were referring to experience. And so there really is a sense of embodiment there that, if we think about information in those other ways, seems to be either cognitive solely or outside of us as a thing, that's something that exists rather than something that is part of us. I don't know if that quite answered your question, but that's my immediate thought.
I think that did answer it. Thank you. That's a really interesting set of insights that all came together there in one two-letter word.
Another question. Open your mic.
I have first a procedural question before the substantive question. Is it fair to ask about things that I read in your dissertation that you didn't mention in your talk today?
It certainly is. Go ahead.
Now it is. Thank you. At one point in your watching theory emerge from your data, you said that you took early versions back to the participants. In your dissertation you talked about a blog. I'm wondering what their reaction was when you did that. Did you get a lot of feedback from them, or not very much? And what kind of feedback? Just anything along those lines that you want to answer.
They were really reluctant to kind of give me feedback on the blog, but when I set a graphic model down in front of them, they all told me exactly what was wrong with it, in no uncertain terms. They were really quite good about that, which was great. I mean, that's what I wanted. And what was nice about that is it really opened up, I mean, one of the things about the experiences, that's how the experiences of information emerged, is because I took this model back to somebody and was like, here's what I'm thinking. And she, when in her response to me, I realized she and I were having completely different conversations about information. And so we had to sit down and have a real long conversation about how she was conceptualizing information and how what I meant by it. Because when I asked her about information, she thought concrete textual, not even pictures. This is a visual artist, but she still was like referred to it as this concrete textual thing. And so this opened up this space for us to discuss what worked and didn't work, and it helped me change. I mentioned this in my dissertation, but it changed my research or my interview questions, because I realized that I had a blind spot about information that we needed to investigate together with the participants in my study. And so they were happy to give me feedback on it in those terms. They were happy to answer my questions when I went back to them with things. They didn't comment on the blog, but they read it. They told me about reading it. They just didn't comment on it.
Thanks.
Well, Marianne, what kind of advice would you give to all kinds of adults who are trying to encourage teens in this sort of way, either in formal education or informal? I mean, this is a whole new world because the opportunities have just grown exponentially. So what advice would you give to adults working with teenagers?
I think the major sort of thing, I have a hard time divorcing myself from that question of my background as teacher. So I have to put it within that framework and that context, because I think the thing that emerged from these teens is that there are two things. One is they need the time. They just need time. And they don't necessarily feel like they have it. This was always a push-pull with a number of the content creators, was finding the time to do what they wanted to do and have that. And so to me, one of the things that I think we need to think about as adults that are working with these kids is that we need to stop over-scheduling and over-testing them, and we need to give them time to muse and reflect. I mean, those are really important key components, and yet that was sometimes the thing that they had the hardest time finding time for. So that would be the first thing. The other thing is that one of the things that they all appreciated about the communities of practice that they were involved in, besides the global nature of it, was the sort of non-judgmental, like sort of constructive criticism that was, they weren't being graded on their work. They weren't being judged on their work explicitly, although they were implicitly. But they all got really constructive feedback too, and they wanted, that was the kind of feedback. So, and they didn't necessarily need that from somebody who would be an established authority. They wanted it from people that they respected, and their respect was born out of their personal aesthetics. It wasn't, this is the right way or the wrong way. It was, wow, that's really cool. I want to be able to do that. And that was the authority person that they would respect.
Well, thank you. That was, I'm sure, a really great, exciting part of your study. Do we have any more questions for Marianne?
Hi, Marianne. Thank you for such a thorough presentation. That was really interesting. I wish we were all there with you in San Jose, imagining David and you in the room. I have two questions which really go back to the very earliest part of the presentation. The first question is about your research question. I thought that I heard you say in the beginning that your research question was framed around how do teens engage, you know, in this digital environment. It was something like that. It was fairly broad, and it was well framed for the grounded theory purpose. And then a little later, you put up a slide which said research question, and that slide said, what are the information practices of content creating teens? And my understanding was that the whole information practice idea emerged later through the grounded theory, and it wasn't actually embedded in the original research question. So would you mind clarifying that for me?
That might have been a little bit of sloppy language, I think, and because it's so difficult to convey this sort of method approach of grounded theory. When I went into the field, I had a very broad research question, and I shouldn't say research question. Let me refocus that. I had a very broad research interest, and that research interest was how do teens engage information in creating and sharing content. As I participated in gathering this data and analyzing it, what came out of that was a more focused research question that sort of shapes the actual dissertation, which is what are information practices of teen content creators. That research question didn't emerge until after the pilot study. Prior to the pilot study, it was more along the lines of this sort of broad thing, and that's very natural in grounded theory research.
Marianne, that was very clear. We need to just make sure that that has that clarity in the introductory chapter of the dissertation as well. So feedback from panel members who just read it recently will be helpful there. I have a second question, which is about the grounded theory method. A lot of grounded theorists will develop as part of their process something which is called a core category. And I noticed that in your particular findings, discussions, you didn't go down that direction. Could you explain that to non-grounded theorists in the audience who may be people who are not so attuned to the different forms of grounded theory, and so may be expecting to hear something like that?
The core categories, I think I just didn't use the language, and it's possible that I didn't use the language in the dissertation either, because the core categories are the actions and the experiences, and then the categories within those things, within those areas. But Sharma's is a constructivist grounded theory. Doesn't focus on core categories quite as much as you would see in more traditional grounded theory from, like, say, Glaser or Strauss and Corbin, because there's this sense that you might possibly be forcing the data into those categories. So I did, when I did do the coding process, I did code for categories, the open coding process. I did, they were shaped by categories, and those were the information action categories and the experiences of information.
Thank you, Marianne. That's great. Congratulations on doing such a wonderful seminar.
Any other questions from anyone in the audience?
I actually have a question. Is it appropriate to ask a question of my panel to think about in terms of feedback?
The mic's yours.
I don't know if you noticed, but I flip-flopped actions and experiences in my presentation. In my dissertation, experiences come before actions. In the presentation, actions become experience. I'm just curious if you noted it and if it mattered to the flow of the actual ideas, and if so, what your recommendation would be on that. So when you guys have a chance to talk, that's something I'd be curious in getting feedback on, because I've been going back and forth on that.
Thank you. We'll try to give you an answer to that. Anyone in the audience can remark on that or ask another question. I think there's another questioner. Go ahead and open your mic.
There. Marianne, there's a whole body of literature that you mentioned in your dissertation about what's variously been called library skills instruction, information literacy, Carol Kultau's model of information seeking. And I have a question, which is, you talk in your dissertation about the fact that this is all very school oriented, and it's student it's teenager as student. In your study, it's teenager as self to a larger extent, and I'm wondering if your findings and what you've learned about teenagers' interactions with information, creation of information, use of information, has any application for the people who are more concerned with teenagers as students, or are these two such separate things that really different kinds of norms and expectations and behaviors come into play?
I think there's application for school. I think the applications are not as immediately obvious as might be seen. For example, I think there's a lot of application for art education in terms of how teens negotiate aesthetics and negotiate control and capacity together. And so I think that in terms of schooling, that what this has is an opportunity to bring libraries into art education and bring those two things together. So I definitely see a connection in that way. And I'm really excited about making these connections between information practices and the body of work that you just referenced a little bit, the information literacy. I've read some stuff recently that sees the connection the same way I'm seeing the connection, so that's where I hope to kind of take it in the future. But I definitely see there's implications for if for no other way, there's implications for how we frame information literacy instruction in the school, as rather than being something very broad as like, these are the skills that you need to be information literate, that these are the skills that you need in this context, or these are how you learn these skills in this context, and sort of framing it as a more contextualized sense rather than the way we currently frame it in K-12 education in particular, where these are skills that you use in all walks of life. And I think you see a little bit in everyday life information seeking research with youth, as well as this research, which is everyday life information. It's just not everyday life information seeking solely. But you see that those sorts of ideas are starting to emerge. I just don't know that they've trickled down into the curriculum yet, but they certainly have implications for that, for praxis.
Thanks. I don't know what our timeline is. I have one more question, but I can ask it of you personally. It doesn't have to come within the seminar. So would somebody guide me as to whether I should ask my other question or just wait?
Well, let me ask, since we're in the same room, let me ask the final call for questions, and otherwise I think we're almost finished. Well, I'm not hearing any other questions. We'll postpone Judy's question and say thank you to everyone who has participated in the seminar, and particularly to Marianne for her excellent presentation to all of us. So thank you to everyone, and good night.
So normally, when we do these online